and how the American-Israeli connection has to be tight.
You know, in many ways it strikes me, though, that this kind of eschatological fear, in common language they say apocalyptic fear, in a way is cancelling out an actual faith in Christ. Because now it all depends on us and how we react, not in how God's plan unfolds. Otherwise, you know, like the holy martyrs went passively into being tortured and killed for Christ's sake. But now there's a very militant type of reactionaryism. Instead of simply saying God's plan is unfolding as it should, and we look forward with joy to the glorious culmination of history and the full manifestation of God's presence and plan. Instead of that, there's simply a great deal of fear that permeates the very soul of society. And it seems to me that that's a loss of faith rather than an expression of faith. And I don't know, as I haven't read the book myself, and so I'm wondering if Marci goes into this deep structural fear that's penetrated society.
No, she doesn't particularly go into that in a lot of detail. What she's doing in the Armageddon Factor is giving a descriptive overview of the different ways the Christian right is working itself out at a level of international relations and a level of domestic issues within not only within the Canadian context, but she looks at all the very close connections between the American right and the Canadian right. So it's an American-Canadian analysis of a nationalist impulse that attempts to rebuild Canadian politics along Puritan lines in many ways. So each chapter she connects the dots very meticulously in terms of who are the key Americans that are moving areas in the direction of, say, creation, evolution, abortion, gay rights, same-sex issues, Jewish Canadian issues, American Zionist issues, and then she points out this is the family tree. These are the men, these are the women, these are the connections, this is the funding, these are the implications, and so each chapter in this it's an unfolding drama of a book, highlights the key players in this drama, but she does not, to answer your question, go to sort of the psychological, spiritual level of exploring the clash between love and fear, because true love casts out fear, and if you're a person of true love, you'll be responding to these issues in a very different way than a fear survival militant mechanism.
Yeah, that's one thing. You and Brad Dursak and I once did a video symposium on deep structural fear, and it always strikes me, though, that this whole unfolding of the religious right and the fear mechanism that goes with it, and the idea that somehow you can build an actual holy nation without free will by legislating people into holiness, that this is actually a loss of faith rather than an expression of a living faith. Because you no longer trust Christ, you no longer trust God, you have to do it yourself. And you can force or bully or coerce people into holiness without any concept of an actual change or transformation of the heart, simply by forcing externally correct behavior, and this will make people holy. And this is the worst thing, I think, and the title, The Armageddon Factor, might play upon it. To what degree are the Canadian religious right groups really desiring the Third World War, as the American religious right is? Really hoping for, trying to create a situation that provokes a Third World War. Is that really present in the Canadian religious right?
Well, I think perhaps its roots are not as much as that at the the levels of origins. It's more a case of Western society is breaking down. It's fragmenting ethically in all sorts of directions. At a domestic level, liberalism is the philosophic roots of this problem, secular humanism. And the argument is that Canada and the United States were founded on Christian principles, Christian ideas. Increasingly, as these societies have become secularized, they not only have moved away from that, but ethically they've lost any mooring, any North Star, and people do what's right in the sight of their own eyes. So They're calling out against what they see as the total loss of moral direction at a personal, ecclesial, national, governmental levels. At the larger international level, the idea is that the West is the great guardian of values or virtues, and increasingly so there, as we enter what Samuel Huntington called a clash of civilizations, our next great foe is going to be some form of militant or radical Islam, and we better be prepared for the showdown at the OK Corral. So it is rooted in what they would see as empirical realities. Now, how they're you may want to say, you are raising some very important points. Your diagnosis is insightful in some ways, but it's problematic in other ways, and your way forward also needs to be questioned. And so one danger, I think, is just to dismiss people like this and say, these are hillbillies from the Catskills and just reactionaries. The other is to say, well, they are trying to articulate the fact there are things not right. Things are rotten in Denmark, as it were. But the way they're interpreting the problem and the way they're pointing the way forward away from the problem is highly problematic.
Yeah, in the first place, isn't it really based on a fantasy? Because the founders, the founding fathers, as they call them, of the United States, had every intention of forming a secular society. And their basic principles were not drawn from Christianity, and most of them weren't actually believing Christians. They were Freemasons, and they were far more interested in what John Locke had to say than what Apostle Paul had to say. That America was founded on the fundamental principles of liberal democracy. Not just democracy, but liberal democracy. And that includes people like Thomas Jefferson and the Adamses and all of these founding fathers were deists, but they weren't Christians. And in their own writings, they will question Christianity. What they wanted was a radical separation of church and state because they thought that religion was in a way a hindrance to progress. Almost all the founding fathers were in the United States were involved in that Masonic universalist ideology and the kind of dualism of John Locke and other philosophers, like even Immanuel Kant, had more impact on the founding of the American Constitution than say Apostle Paul or the Four Gospels. And Canada was certainly not founded on liberal democratic principles to begin with, because we're still a monarchy, and by choice. So the Red Tory tradition in Canada seems to have faded a great deal and lost its potency, because it really was a Red Tory tradition upon which Canada was founded.
Well, I think perhaps two things need to be mentioned. The United States had these two sources, to be fair to the founding of the States. One was the Puritan Calvinist tradition that you mentioned earlier. It was deeply religious. And then there was this much more secular form of liberalism or deism. Even though they differed at a theological level, they agreed at certain basic level of principles of liberty, equality, of individuality, a suspicion of the state to some degree. So there was a difference on their sort of theological, philosophical prejudices or premises. But when it came to the underlying principles of what the United States should be, there was a certain level of agreement. Now in Canada, this is where the dilemma is with the rise of Christian nationalism in Canada, because many of these nationalists who see themselves reclaiming God's dominion from sea to sea, getting back to the origins, the founding of this country, what has to be asked of such people is, in returning us to our origins, is whose interpretation of our origins? And many of the people that Marci McDonald mentions in the Armageddon Factor have a very weak and skewed and limited understanding of the origins of Canadian history itself. One of the great differences between, say, the United States and Canada, some people say they're both founded on a Christian tradition. The big question that has to be asked is, whose version of the Christian tradition? The United States was founded primarily on a combination of the Puritan tradition or the Calvinist tradition and then some form of secular liberalism. So you get a